So we've gotten our hands on an Xbox Series X, and we figured while we're testing that out for a before you buy a review video, why not have some dumb fun in the meantime? We wanted to take a trip into the future and the past, so we stacked up the new Xbox Series X against the original Microsoft Xbox. A lot of the differences may seem completely obvious, but stacking them up next to each other is incredibly sobering and a blast, so we've come a long way. Let's talk about it. In 1998, some Microsoft engineers set out to build a Windows and DirectX based game console to compete with Sony's PlayStation 2, not only for market share, but developer interest. Yeah, in 1998, one of the big concerns was to make sure developers were still attracted to developing for Windows platforms first and foremost. So then, after lots of debate over the name of the console, the Xbox was announced at GDC in March of 2000. The Xbox was then officially unveiled to the public during a big event at CES 2001. Not gonna lie, anytime we do this type of video, I always just mention this event to be able to bring up the fact that The Rock and Bill Gates revealed this thing, and it's so hilarious and dated anyway, but I love you, Dwayne, call me dude. Anyways, you know how it goes from there. It released on November 15th, 2001 in North America, and went on to sell over 24 million units throughout the world, and despite being the new kid on the gaming block, it broke through and got its place in the winner's circle alongside Sony and Nintendo, which is impressive to say the least. Looking at the console's physical design, this was a pretty large young man, weighing in at around 9 pounds. It of course looks very appropriate for the era it was released in. It screams early 2000s. But you gotta admit, the branding was pretty on point with it having that big giant plastic X and that green core in the middle of it. Overall, this big plastic box was big for its time when stacked against the competition, and it's still a pretty thick boy today. Even still, the next generation looks to be the biggest consoles yet, and the Series X here does tower over the original Xbox. Look at these guys next to each other. You'll notice I haven't said much about the actual console unit of the Series X itself because it's so simple. The thing seems to be designed to just kind of disappear into your living room. Granted, the size isn't helping it, but everything else from just the plain old matte plastic finish, lack of anything lighting up other than the Xbox power button, keeps this thing super duper simple. And no, contrary to what a lot of people have been believing, the thing on top, the grate with the green in it, that is not a light, that is just painted plastic. Painted green plastic, almost like that green plastic on the top of the original Xbox, actually. Oh, but then of course, there's the Xbox 360, which I think deserves an honorable mention here. I know this is mostly an original Xbox versus Series X video, but excuse me for a second, I get distracted. We always get sidetracked here. I think the design of this thing was the best in between of like tacky early 2000s and then smart, modern, simple tech design like the Series X. This Xbox 360 was weirdly slim and compact, and even the redesigns were nice. The power button was really cool. Also, faceplates. They were awesome. Always want to give those a shout out. It's nice to see that PlayStation 5 might bring back faceplates in a way, and we hope Xbox could too. Anyway, I digress. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to one of the cooler consoles. Where was I? Now, specs-wise, the original Xbox had a custom 32-bit 733MHz Pentium 3 processor with 64 megabytes of DDR SD RAM, and it had an NVIDIA GPU, the NV2A. It was capable of making games that looked like this. 18 or so years later, we have the Xbox Series X and its beefy console specs. The CPU is a custom AMD Zen 2, 8 cores at 3.8 gigahertz, and then the GPU is a custom RDNA 2 with Navi architecture, 12 teraflops, 52 CUs at 1.825 gigahertz, and it has 16 gigs of GDDR6 compared to the original's mere 64 megabytes of RAM. For storing games on it, the Xbox Series X has a custom 1 terabyte PCIe 4.0 NVMe SSD, loading in games in mere seconds. On the original Xbox side, it had a whopping 8 or 10 gigabyte hard drive. That was a pretty novel feature for the time. It was the first mainstream console to utilize a hard disk drive, and it was so cool for people because it eliminated the need for a mandatory memory card. Not to mention the fact that you could store music files on the thing. Now, consoles rely on onboard storage for the games to run themselves. Now, the biggest thing, the actual performance. Visually, the original Xbox had the ability to output at 720p and 1080i, but most games were typically 480. Series X puts out some games at 4K or 2K resolution, native or otherwise, that are also HDR. HDR, of course, was something that didn't exist on TVs during the original Xbox days, but the Series X targets games up to 120 frames per second, and often at high refresh rates too. Now, we're still testing ours. We don't know how common those high levels of performance marks are going to be seen, but the machine has capabilities like this, and ray tracing as well, and just other crazy stuff, like massive worlds loaded in so fast, stuff that the original Xbox couldn't even touch. Now, we always say this, as your eyes get used to the new advances in technology, you can take for granted stuff like HD and high resolution, but going back, you really can notice a difference. Not only the shift from the older 640 by 480 resolutions, but just the number of pixels from a 480p Xbox game to a 4K Xbox Series X game. The jump is from hundreds of thousands of pixels to millions and millions of pixels. Then, of course, don't forget, the original Xbox could connect to the internet. It had a port, another big feature for a game console at the time. And then, of course, came Xbox Live. With a wired Ethernet connection and an Xbox Live subscription, you could play games online. Halo 2 being one of the big standouts for a lot of people. You could download stuff, and you could just connect with friends. Now, like it or not, but practically everything is online in gaming, from the games themselves, content, updates, communication, everything in between. Has it gone too far? Maybe, but it's humble to see the early days of it still when you put these two side by side. Now in 2020, there's Game Pass, and then whatever is going to come beyond that. But then, of course, the last thing, the controllers, the point of input, the thing you're using the most out of anything other than your eyeballs. Technology-wise, the shift is obvious, wired to wireless, but from a design standpoint, holding them both in your hands, that's where you realize the subtleties and the evolution. The Xbox controller was a big old brute, and it was quickly redesigned to be what we have here. Even still, this version of the controller is incredibly bulky and chunky, and while button placement at the time proved to be pretty correct and good for usability, the plastic frame around those ideas is what makes the controller feel so old now. The newest Xbox Series X controller is slightly redesigned from the Xbox One version, and it has the best D-pad it's ever had, strongest wireless connectivity, and a really nice textured finish compared to the original's slick, black, potentially greasy plastic. It feels way less like a toy and more like an actual tech product. And really, that leads us to a conclusion here. The Xbox has grown up. Both consoles have grown up. Obviously, the spec jump is massive, and the technology is super impressive in 2020, but as a product, the Series X is a mature, plain black, quiet matte tower, where the original Xbox is a giant X with neon green in the center, and it just screams high school yearbook. I think inside and out, putting these two bad boys side by side just shows how far we've come in gaming and tech, whether you're an Xbox fan or not. There are still lots of questions about the future of gaming and Series X. What is Microsoft's whole platform ecosystem thing going to mean going forward? What kind of games are we going to be playing? We're just going to have to enjoy the ride and find out, but we want to hear from you guys in the comments what you thought about these two consoles side by side. Have you ever fired up an old Xbox and then fired up an Xbox One? Do you have any observations that we didn't include? We'd love to hear from you guys down in the comments. But if you enjoyed this video, clicking the like button does legit help us out. We would appreciate that. And if you're new, consider subscribing, maybe hitting that notification bell, because we put out videos every single day. But hey, as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time.